Imagine it's July 15th, 1983. You're in Tokyo, in a shop that's usually stacked with Game & Watch units and plastic robots. Today, there's a line out the door for something new. A small red and white box, no screen of its own. It plugs into the television your family watches the news on. And it turns into something else entirely. Inside the box, 3 names you already know from the arcade. A carpenter climbing barrels to save a girl. That same carpenter's brother doing much the same thing. And a sailor man who eats spinach. You've played all 3 standing up, feeding in coins. And today, for 14,800 yen, you can bring them home. Nobody in the shop knows yet that there's a flaw hiding in one of the chips inside. Or that in a few weeks, Nintendo is going to recall every single unit it just sold, even the ones that work perfectly fine, just to protect what this little box is about to become. Because what it's about to become is the opening movie in something much, much bigger. A thread that keeps looping back to the middle of July, decade after decade, to a summoner's pilgrimage across a dying world. A smuggler turned reluctant Jedi, a submarine crew trapped with something in the water that shouldn't be there, and a samurai making his last stand on an island he can't save the old way. We're talking about all this and more on This Week in Video Game History. Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, Doug Coleman, and this week we are covering July 13th through July 19th, the week the home console industry truly began. It's a week that gave us the console that started it all in Japan, a submarine mission gone wrong on a console nobody bought, a monkey hunting sequel with a net gun, a summoner's pilgrimage that brought voice acting to a genre that never had it before, a smuggler who finds out he used to be someone entirely else, and a samurai's last stand on an island the empire's already written off. Plus, 3 stories worth slowing down for. The recall that almost sank Nintendo before it started, the black-cartridge outlaws who tried to break its lock and got buried for it, and 2 off-duty doctors who started a game studio out of pure boredom with medicine. So grab your controller and press start to continue. Here's where it all starts. On July 15th, 1983, Nintendo released the family computer in Japan, a small red and white box that plugged into the television and did something no Japanese console had really pulled off before. It made the arcade feel like it fit in your living room. It launched at 14,800 yen, with 3 games built to prove the point: Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Arcade hits everybody already knew. Arcade hits players already knew. Now playable at home for the price of a cartridge instead of a pocket full of coins. The engineering behind it was scrappier than the finished product let on. Lead designer Masayuki Yumura wanted a 16-bit machine with a disk drive. Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi wanted something Nintendo could actually afford to sell. So Yumura's team built an 8-bit machine instead, streaming graphics off the cartridge in real time to keep costs down. And Yamauchi got the chip manufacturer Ricoh to agree to Nintendo's price by promising an order of 3 million units he hadn't actually locked in yet. It worked. Sega released a rival console, the SG-1000, on that exact same day, and history barely remembers it, while the Famicom went on to define an entire industry's next decade. But the road from July 15th to best-selling console in Japan wasn't a straight line. There was a problem waiting in the hardware itself, and it nearly ended things before they really began. We'll get to that in a deep dive later today. Same date, 20 years later, a galaxy far, far away. On July 15th, 2003, LucasArts published Knights of the Old Republic, developed by a small Edmonton studio that had spent the previous several years quietly becoming one of the best storytellers in the industry. You play a soldier serving the Republic, fighting the Sith, doing what a Star Wars game is supposed to let you do. Until roughly halfway through, the game reveals that everything you thought you knew about your own character was a lie. It's one of the great twists in gaming, and 2 decades later, people still ask new players not to spoil it. What made KOTOR land wasn't just the Star Wars license. LucasArts had made plenty of forgettable Star Wars games before this one. It was that the studio behind it had built its entire identity around treating player choice as the actual engine of the story, not a bonus feature bolted into a linear plot. Light side, dark side, and everything in between actually reshaped how the galaxy responded to you. Some of my favorite gaming memories come from this game. The first time I heard HK-47 call someone a meatbag still makes me laugh. But the memory that sticks in my heart the most, the time I did a pure dark side playthrough. When you got to Dantooine and worked to resolve the feud between the Martells and the Sandrels, there was a moment you almost save both families. But then you get this option, and both families end up annihilating each other. I laughed so hard at that moment. It was one of the best moments to me in all of gaming, and it made me fall in love with the studio. It won Game of the Year from multiple outlets, sold Xboxes on its own merits, and cemented a partnership between LucasArts and a developer that, at the time, most players had never heard of. That developer has a strange origin story all of its own, one that starts nowhere near a game studio. We're going to come back to that one. And now for our obscure pick of the week, a survival horror game that should have made Sega a household name in this genre. It instead watched Capcom run away with it. On July 16th, 1998, Sega published Deep Fear in Japan for the Saturn, a game built almost entirely as an answer to Resident Evil, right down to the fixed camera angles and the tank controls. But instead of a mansion full of zombies, Deep Fear traps you 300 meters under the Pacific Ocean in an underwater research facility called the Big Table, playing a former Navy SEAL named John Mayer as an outbreak turns the crew into something else. Oxygen becomes its own resource to manage alongside ammo and health. Fire your gun too much, and you burn through the air faster. And it had a real pedigree behind it. Co-producer Ryoko Kodami, known for her work on Phantasy Star, and a score from composer Kenji Kiowa. Critics in Japan and Europe liked it well enough, but it arrived 2 full years after Resident Evil had already defined the genre on a console that was already circling the drain in the West. And Sega never brought it to North America. It wasn't part of the plan by that point. It's the kind of game that had everything it needed except good timing. The Saturn was dying and Sega knew it. And Deep Fear ended up being one of the last real swings anyone took on that hardware before everyone's attention moved on. One island, one impossible choice. On July 17th, 2020, Sucker Punch Productions released Ghost of Tsushima, dropping players into 1274 as the Mongol Empire invades the island of Tsushima and wipes out nearly the entire samurai defense force in a single battle. You play Jin Saki, one of the last survivors, and the game's entire emotional spine is the tension between everything Jin has been raised to be, a samurai bound by honor and open combat, and everything he has to become to actually save his home, an assassin who strikes from the shadows and breaks every rule of the code he grew up with. It's gorgeous in a way screenshots really undersell. Fields of pampas grass rippling in the wind, the camera itself used as a compass so you never have to look at a minimap. Autumn leaves and foxes' dens, and hot springs scattered across an island that clearly wanted to be walked through slowly, not sprinted across. Sucker Punch, a studio that had spent its earlier years on Sly Cooper and Infamous, built something that felt like a genuine love story to a genre and a country neither Western studio had really tried to earn before. It sold over 2.4 million copies in its first 3 days, becoming one of the fastest-selling original PlayStation IPs ever, and later got a full director's cut expansion and a stage play adaptation in Japan. Not bad for a game that opens with its hero losing almost everything. This is one of those games that has been on my wish list for years. It looks so amazing, and the genre and the era in history is one of the most fascinating times in human history to me. I definitely need to pick it up sometime. Or maybe I need to actually, get a PlayStation one day. And now for something considerably sillier. On July 18th, 2002, Sony released Ape Escape 2 in Japan, the sequel to a game that, back in 1999, was the first title ever to require an analog controller to play. The premise has not gotten any more dignified in the sequel. A professor's grandnephew named Jimmy accidentally scatters 300 monkeys, now armed with helmets to boost their intelligence, across the world, and it's your job to run them down and catch them with a butterfly net. What made the original Ape Escape genuinely clever was how it used both analog sticks at once, years before that became a standard. One stick to move, the other to aim and fire an ever-growing arsenal of gadgets, from stun clubs to RC cars to a slingshot that fires monkeys back at other monkeys. The sequel doubles down on the toolkit rather than reinventing it, adding a handful of new gadgets and refining the parts that already worked. It's not a landmark the way some of this week's other entries are, but it's a generally fun, purely goofy platformer from a studio that knew exactly what its audience wanted, released at a moment when Sony could afford to let a franchise just be charming instead of groundbreaking. And we close this week with a pilgrimage. On July 19th, 2001, Square released Final Fantasy X in Japan, the first mainline entry in the series built for the PlayStation 2, and the first to give its characters actual voices. That alone changed everything about how a Final Fantasy game could tell a story. A decade of text boxes gave way to real performances, awkward as some of those early voice direction could be. The story follows Titus, a star athlete pulled 1,000 years into the future, who joins a young summoner named Yuna on a pilgrimage across the world of Spira. The story follows Titus, a star athlete pulled 1,000 years into the future, who joins a young summoner named Yuna on a pilgrimage across the world of Spira to defeat a reoccurring apocalyptic threat called Sin, a journey that both of them know from the very start is not built to end happily for everyone involved. It's one of the more openly emotional stories the series ever told, anchored by a turn-based battle system, the sphere grid that let you shape any character into almost any role you wanted. It sold 1.4 million copies in Japan in its first day alone, became the best-selling game in PlayStation 2 history in Japan, and marked Square's full confident arrival on Sony's new hardware. A very different company from the one nearly staring down bankruptcy just a few years earlier. It's a good note to end this week on. An entire studio's fortunes quietly turned around one pilgrimage at a time. I have played lots of Final Fantasy games, but this one is honestly the first one I ever completed. The Blitzball side quest kept me so entertained. I loved it. The storyline was enjoyable, though Titus does tend to get a little annoying, and the summons were beautiful. And just between you and me, Lulu unlocked a love of sharp-tongued gothic women that is still with me today. This is one of those games that I wish I could go back in time and experience again for the first time. I told you there was a problem waiting inside the hardware. Here it is. Weeks after the Famicom launched, reports started coming in from all over Japan. The console would just freeze mid-game. Turns out there was a genuine flaw baked into one of the chips. Uemura himself later described it almost sheepishly, saying that under certain conditions in certain games, the graphics would glitch and the software simply couldn't recover. That wasn't a rare unit here and there. It was in every single Famicom sold. Yamauchi's response was the kind of move that either bankrupts a company or builds it. He ordered a full recall. Not just the defective units, all of them, including the consoles that were working perfectly fine, and replaced every motherboard at Nintendo's own expense, free of charge, no questions asked. It could have sunk the console before it found its footing. Instead, it did the opposite. Japanese retailers who'd watched the American industry implode just months earlier under a flood of broken, rushed-out garbage saw a company that ate a massive cost rather than let a bad product sit on the shelves. Then, the Famicom moved 500,000 units before the year was out and became Japan's best-selling console within a year. Sometimes the thing that saves a company isn't the product. It's what you're willing to do when the product fails. There's a much longer version of this story, the chip, the negotiation with Raiko, the president who bet the whole launch on a number he hadn't actually locked in. And we're going to have to tell that properly another time. That same protective instinct Nintendo showed with the Famicom recall, a few years later, it turned into something closer to a weapon. By the late 80s, Nintendo controlled the NES so tightly that third-party publishers could only publish 5 games a year, all of them subject to Nintendo's approval, all of them manufactured on Nintendo's terms. One of those third parties, Atari Games, got sick of it, and under a label called Tengen, decided to stop asking permission. There was a lock keeping unauthorized cartridges off the NES, a chip called the 10NES. Tengen's engineers couldn't crack it on their own, so their lawyers went to the US Copyright Office, claimed they needed the code for an actual lawsuit against Nintendo, and used it to build their own version of the chip. It worked, technically. Tengen started shipping unlicensed games in distinctive black cartridges, including its own version of Tetris, built from scratch by designer Ed Logg. And then, in June of 1989, a federal court ruled against them, not because reverse engineering itself was illegal, but because Tengen had lied to get the code in the first place. The judge called it unclean hands. Every copy of Tengen's Tetris got recalled and destroyed. An estimated 50,000 of them gone. Atari Games never really recovered from it. Nintendo, on the other hand, walked away having proven exactly how far it was willing to go to protect the walls it built around its own hardware. The same instinct for control that just a few years earlier had made it recall an entire console rather than let a flawed one reach customers. The same company, same instinct. 2 completely different outcomes. There's a lot more to this story. The Soviet chess match over who actually owned Tetris, the retailers caught in the middle, and it deserves its own telling. Another time. You just heard about the studio behind Knights of the Old Republic. Here's how 3 medical doctors ended up building it. Before we dive fully into this, I really need to express how this makes me happy and excites me to do these podcasts. It's one of those stories that really surprised me, very much like finding out Ken Jeong is a real-life, successful doctor before becoming Senior Chang in Community. In the mid-90s, Ray Mazuka and Greg Zeschuk were finishing up residencies in family medicine at the University of Alberta, alongside a third classmate, Augustine Yip. On the side, purely for fun, they'd been writing medical education software, an acid-based physiology simulator, a gastroenterology patient simulator, the kind of thing you'd build when you're the type of person who can't leave a problem alone. One day over lunch, they realized something. Hospitals wanted their software, but nobody wanted to actually pay for it. Meanwhile, the three of them had, between them, played more or less every computer game that existed. On February 1st, 1995, in a small room in Zestchuk's basement, they incorporated a company called Bioware. They pulled together their own savings, made a list of the biggest game publishers in the world, split it in half, and started cold calling. Nobody picked up. Mazuka called one publisher, Interplay, at least 10 times over a couple of weeks, until someone there told him to stop calling, and, if it would make him go away, agreed to look at a demo. Interplay called back the very next day and flew them out to California. That demo became Shattered Steel, a mech combat game, and BioWare's first shipped title. It's a strange enough origin story on its own. Doctors moonlighting into a completely different industry almost by accident. But the part that really matters is what came after Shattered Steel. A story-driven fantasy RPG called Baldur's Gate, and that would go on to revive an entire genre, and set the studio on a path that, a few years later, would put them in a galaxy far, far away. How three physicians who'd never made a game before built one of the most respected studios in RPG history, that's a story worth its own hour. Another time, guys. Imagine it's July 15th, 1983. That same shop in Tokyo a few weeks later, the line's gone, in its place is a very different scene. A clerk carefully swapping out motherboard after motherboard, one Famicom at a time, for free, because Nintendo said so. Nobody in that shop is thinking about Star Wars, or a pilgrimage across a dying world, or a samurai losing everything he was raised to be. They're just watching a company make good on something it didn't have to make good on. That instinct, protect the thing even when it costs you, shows up again and again this week, if you look for it. It's there in the studio eating the cost of a full recall instead of letting a broken product slide. It's there in Nintendo a few years later, going to court to defend the walls it built around its own hardware, for better or for worse. It's there in two doctors who couldn't stop tinkering with something that wasn't their job, until it became the only job they wanted. And it's there the swordsman on an island deciding that protecting his home matters more than protecting the code he was raised on. None of these stories start out looking like the ones we tell 20, 30, 40 years ago. A defective chip, a basement in Edmonton, a monkey with a net gun. But that's the thing about this medium. It rarely announces which moments is going to matter. It just asks you to show up and see what you're willing to protect when it counts. All right, everybody, that's it for this episode. Thank you all so much for sticking around. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe over on YouTube or follow the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps. Artwork for the show is done by Ms. Tink. Music's produced by Shane Mandini. Go follow him on Twitch and Spotify and listen to all his great work. The show was written, produced, and hosted by me, Doug Coleman. Be sure to save your game, nerds. I'll see you next week.